The next unit that we're going to be looking at is the Cold War era. As you can see from this title slide, we have the flags from the United States and the Soviet Union. And what we want to remember as we're looking at the Cold War era is the fact that both of these countries were on the winning side of World War II, right? However, they have very different political ideologies. So at the very top of your guided notes page, there's a question that says, what do we love? And here in the United States, we love freedom. I know that the photo on there is really corny, but just go with me for a second here. The idea of freedoms in the United States is it's really part of our foundation, right? Having a small central government. The fact that we are in a democracy and the main goal of the government is to protect the rights and freedoms of all people here. We want to secure that freedom for everyone around the world. And what we were fearful of with communism is that the communists were trying to take away some of those freedoms. We're going to take a minute and look at post-war perspectives of both the United States and the Soviet Union. So at the end of World War II, the United States was trying to bring democracy around the world. It's one of the reasons why they joined both World War I and World War II was to make the world safe for democracy. They also wanted to make sure that the world could live in a capitalist system where the sky's the limit. It would bring economic opportunity to people. With capitalism, the idea is that, supply and demand, that's kind of what determines prices, and it lets individuals make the decision. So that's what the United States was pushing for, was democratic societies that were capitalist. The Soviet Union, however, they wanted to secure a worldwide communist system. And we can kind of go back a couple of units when we're talking about communism. We're talking about a government controlling the economy. But of course, that goes directly against the US notion of capitalism. So the Soviet Union, again, they're trying to get communist nations. They create what are called satellite nations along the way. Those are nations that would be communist and work with the Soviet Union. And the problem that people saw at the time, and this is kind of what sparks the whole idea of the Cold War, is that you cannot have capitalism and communism coexisting. You can't have both of them happening in the world at the same time. And because of that, conflict was inevitable. One major issue that the United States has with the Soviet Union at this time is the Soviets spreading communism. After the fall of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union starts to create their own power, to start to take control, and they start with the Eastern European nations. So as you can see by looking at this list, these are nations that had been liberated from Nazi Germany, right? They were once under control of Nazi Germany. They now are free nations. However, look what the Soviet Union does to them. They step in, they silence all opposition, anyone who might be against a potential communist leader coming in. If you look at the example of Hungary, the Soviet Union communists, they actually occupy Hungary until they had control of the police force and again would arrest or silence the opposition. In Romania, they forced the Romanian king to name a communist prime minister. And so what we see happening here is that the Soviets are doing something similar to what the Germans were doing in trying to force their way into countries and make sure that they would have political control over them. So as the Soviets were taking over Eastern Europe, you had the western part of Europe, which was that had formed rather democracies. And so at this time, we have this figurative curtain that falls, known as the Iron Curtain. And Churchill is one who kind of had nicknamed this by saying the Iron Curtain has descended over the continent. If you look at where that line is, if you look at the map there, basically everything to the west is going to be blue, and that's going to be democratic. Everything to the right in red there, that is going to be a communist nation. And so it's almost as if there is this line drawn in Europe. You've got the democratic west and the communist east. So the Iron Curtain is a symbolic political border. If you watch the Butter Battle book, the video that I put on here earlier, that was the wall that was built in that. They're representing the Iron Curtain. And this starts then the Cold War, which is a struggle that lasts over 50 years between the United States and the Soviet Union to be the world's superpower. If we look at the overall tone of the Cold War, you have George Kennan, and he's quoted in here. He was the US diplomat to Russia, and he comes up with this idea of containment. So according to him, he says, quote, the tone of the Cold War is, quote, long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies, right? The idea there is to contain it. We know that we can no longer prevent the Soviets from turning Eastern Europe into communist nations. It's already happened. We've already lost Eastern Europe to communism. But what can we do to prevent further spread of it? And the question then is, we fought in World War II to make the world safe for democracy, just like we fought World War One for that same reason. And so why would we fight these wars only to let communism spread? So at this point, we go with the idea of containment. Again, we can't stop it from spreading to Eastern Europe. It's already there, but can we spread it from going anywhere else? The other thing that we need to pay attention to is the fear that this causes, the fear of nuclear war, right? What will prevent the Soviet Union from bombing the United States? The United States, we were the first ones to use atomic weapons in war. Now we know just how dangerous they can be. And so the fear is what if someone else uses that technology against us? So one of the first major clashes between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War has to do with this blockade in the city of Berlin. So I just want to review too, it is called the Cold War because there's no actual military confrontation between the United States and Soviet Union. There are a lot of satellite wars that we may be back opposing sides to. We don't actually have any kind of military confrontation between the United States and the Soviets. So that's why it's known as the Cold War. But this gets pretty close. The Berlin airlift gets pretty close to actual military confrontation. So just as a reminder, if you remember post World War II, that the country of Germany was split into four, with the United States, France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union each getting a chunk of Germany, and that the city of Berlin was also split into four. But if you remember, the city of Berlin was actually located in the Soviet sector of Germany. So it was in East Germany, which was communist. So what we have is the city of Berlin, again, sectioned off into fourths, and one section of it is controlled by the Soviets. The other three sections were actually united with Great Britain, France, United States. Their sections had been united. So you now have West Berlin and East Berlin. Of course, as we know, then in 1948, Great Britain, France, the United States, they unite their democratic zones in Germany. So we end up with two separate countries, East Germany and West Germany. Stalin, of course, refuses to unite his portion of Germany with the rest. And he actually then creates this blockade between East and West Berlin by the building of the Berlin Wall that separates East and West Berlin. But then what he also did, because the city of Berlin, again, remember, was in the Soviet sector, what he also did then was to cut off the food and fuel supply chain from trains coming in to West Berlin. And so because of this, you had massive shortages of food, fuel, and other supplies, including medical supplies. So what the United States had to do for 15 months was actually fly over the Soviet section of Germany, and they would have to fly into Berlin and land in Berlin and drop off supplies. Apparently, a plane landed nearly every 3 minutes, and over 1.5 million tons of supplies were actually dropped off for the people in West Berlin, until, of course, Stalin backs off and opens it back up. One thing that we want to look at while this is happening, right, while the Soviets are kind of, forcing the idea of communism on these Eastern European nations, is where in the world is the United Nations, right? Where is it? We talked about the creation of the United Nations post World War II. It's one of the legacies of the war. Obviously, it's still around today. And the idea of the United Nations is to prevent things like this, prevent one country from going in and kind of bullying other countries in that way. But the United Nations really wasn't doing too much. The reason why is because the Soviet Union was using their own veto power within the United Nations. And so what the United States decided that they needed more protection against the Soviets. They believed that the Soviets were being really aggressive. So the United States wanted more protection, and also more protection for democracies around the Soviet Union as well. And so they formed what's known as NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's an association of democratic, peace-loving states, and it's made up of 12 nations. The idea with NATO is that it was a defensive alliance. So an attack on one nation would mean like attacking all of them. All right, so if you are in NATO, you're in this organization. If someone attacks you, then the other countries would step up and help. They would not help you, though, if you were the one that was the aggressor. All right, so it was basically a defensive alliance between 12 nations that all believed in democracy. The Soviet Union, then, of course, they believed that they needed to have their own club as well. So they formed what's known as the Warsaw Pact. So again, for them, it's a defensive military pact with their own satellite nations. I mentioned earlier in this lecture the tone of fear, right? The idea that the United States had used atomic weapons. And we, of course, know that we are not going to be the only ones with that type of technology, that the Soviets were going to have it as well. As we can see by looking at this slide, in 1949, Truman, who was president at the time, actually makes an announcement that the United States has seen enough evidence that they believe that the Soviet Union has created an atomic bomb. So the question then is, well, where are they going to use it and when? Is it going to be used maybe in New York, or is it going to be in Los Angeles, right? What is the fate of the United States going to be now that the Soviets have an atomic weapon as well? We also believe that we wanted to be superior. We wanted to be more advanced than the Soviets as well. So in 1950, we start working on a thermonuclear bomb to maintain that superiority. And this is where we get into that arms race. In 52, we have the first successful test of the thermonuclear bomb, which is much more advanced bomb than the atomic one. As soon as we knew that the Soviets had the technology to potentially bomb the United States, the Federal Civil Defense Administration steps in and they help prepare Americans for a possible nuclear attack. They would create pamphlets or leaflets that would provide instructions as to how to survive from an atomic bomb. Building bomb shelters at schools. Many schools had bomb shelters created in them. Many homes that were just built had bomb shelters built within them as well. Students would practice air raid drills. So much as today we practice our own kind of duck and cover drills, they had those as well, but theirs were air raid drills for a potential bombing. And we just saw this overall fear start to creep into the American people. When you're done with this, I want you to watch a video that was put out by the Federal Civil Defense Administration. You're going to realize when you watch the video, it's a little ridiculous. In it, they claim that things like newspapers can help protect you from an atomic bomb. So it's a little ridiculous, but I think the idea when they put those videos out was to give people a sense of control over a situation that we all knew that we had no control over. But it did make people feel better that they could do, something to try to protect themselves in the best way that they know how. When we've talked about fear during the semester, we've talked about how it oftentimes leads people to make decisions or do things that they wouldn't normally do, but that fear in them kind of forces them in that way or leads them to become a little bit irrational. And so what happens is the fear not only of being attacked by the Soviets kind of comes into play, but also the fear that there are Soviet spies maybe living amongst us in the United States. So that's what we were worried about, is that the communists had spies, that there were Soviet communist spies living within our country, and that they were eventually going to attempt to overthrow our government. And so because of that, we have a couple of committees that are created. The Loyalty Review Board, their job was to investigate government officials to make sure that they weren't doing anything that might come across as being sympathizers to the communists or to the Soviets. You also have the creation of HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. Their job was to make sure that communists do not infiltrate just regular citizens like your neighbors or the media. The biggest worry about HUAC had was that you would have communists that would have a big stage. So famous people potentially, or movie directors. They worried about the media. They worried about teachers, thinking that teachers maybe had some kind of control over students, and so that they were very worried about them as well. And that brings us to the Hollywood 10. The Hollywood 10 were a group of filmmakers, and they just flat out refused to answer some of the questions that were being asked of them and their ties to the Communist Party. No one really ever had any evidence, but they just refused to answer the questions. And because of that, they actually were thrown in jail. Now, if we think about our American values that we came up with at the beginning of the semester, this goes directly against those American values. And we start becoming very hypocritical that we're in this to protect freedoms for people. However, we really weren't protecting the freedoms of people who maybe didn't want to answer those questions. So it happens to those filmmakers and others that refuse to answer questions as they are blacklisted. What that means is that you're put on a list and then people would not hire you.